Welcome to United Jews channel.
And
That's the
also,
thing. People don't want to consider that they aren't like good at something because it makes them feel insecure about themselves. And
mm-hmm,
it's much easier to say that it's somebody else's fault.
mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. There are two other things that bother me about that. First of all, it really bothers me, like when you mention like the whole thing with sexism. It bothers me when people say like, oh, there should be like, for example, more women in parliament. And I used to be like, yeah, that makes sense. But I've kind of been thinking about that, like about like those kinds of opinions specifically, like, well, if you think that, well, then maybe you could kind of um go get like the kind of education you need to become like one of the women in parliament. Like if you want to make a change, you could go and make it. If you want to go see a change, you could go and like be that change, right? And that's something that we hear a lot, but I feel like a lot of people are forgetting that too. And so it's really frustrating when I hear like, oh, people should just be like less exclusive, or like you could just make yourself more qualified. Obviously, that doesn't work all the time, but that's just another way to kind of take a step forward to start fighting back. And another thing that really bothers me is when like some people, I mentioned this earlier, but sometimes people will be like, oh, my friend said it's okay, so I can do it. And then people will respond to that friend like, oh, like, what do you know? You've clearly been brainwashed, or you're clearly not like inherently part of like our group because you think this way. And it's really frustrating for me because on one side, when you're considered to be privileged, you can't really say anything because whenever you say something, as the article points out, you're saying it from a place of privilege, and because you don't want to lose that privilege, which isn't always true. And then on the other side, there are people who are part of the group who just don't agree with the general opinion, and they're labeled as defective because they don't agree. Like if they were actual members of the group, they would agree. And it's really frustrating because it's not like neither side can kind of stick up for each other because there's always an excuse of, oh, well, you've been brainwashed, or, oh, you're speaking from a place of privilege. Of course, you'd support that. So that's something else that I know causes me to kind of shy away from discussions like that a little bit because I'm afraid that if I say something, it's like, oh, well, obviously you'd say that because you're this, and this, which isn't always true. So, yeah, that's something else that really bothers me about that kind of way of thinking, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially with the make yourselves a change thing. I think that's a problem with a lot of the a lot of the people who are like very loud about their opinions. They're like the number one, I'm sorry. They're like the number one person saying that, oh, these people are all sexist and these people are all racist and those people are transphobic or something. And they're just like pointing fingers. The person who does that is usually like a college student who doesn't even have a job, or just somebody who still like lives in their parents' house at like 40 and never had a job in their life. So
Mm.
it's like very easy to point fingers, but at the same time, like why don't the same people just go out there and do something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like it's not necessarily that they might be part of a certain group. What I feel like it's more, like you pointed out earlier, I feel like a lot of people just want to feel like they belong, and that they kind of want themselves to be considered valid. And so a lot of the time they kind of, I guess the term is for that is keyboard warriors, like especially people that on the internet go and like, rant and stuff. I feel like it's not necessarily again that they like belong to a certain group. It's more that um they're just really looking for a way to kind of find support. And because they're not finding it in the usual way, they kind of go to extremes. And that actually ties into something else that I forgot to mention earlier. Like a lot of the what I tend to see is a lot of the people doing like the calling out are people who aren't even like part of the group that is supposedly being affected by some kind of like sexist, racist, for example, remark. And it's just really confusing because I remember, yeah, I've been kind of like getting into like this stuff lately because it's interesting to think about. But I remember I saw this this one girl on Twitter's not the best place to share opinions, obviously, but she pointed out that, you know, like sometimes it's not that, like, for example, just say like what she said, it's not that all men necessarily are bad, it's just that you had a bad experience and you're just ready to like group everyone into like one category because of like that one guy, that one bad guy they ran into. And I noticed that a lot of the people that were kind of harassing her for that opinion were actually guys, which didn't make much sense to me because if if you follow like the theory of the woke movement, like the ones who should be doing the judging are the ones who are supposedly affected, right? Like the women, for example, in this case. And yet for some reason, it's the guys who are saying stuff, and it gets really dicey. It starts the two sides start contradicting themselves, and it's like, wait a second, like I thought it was supposed to work this way. Why isn't it working this way? It just seems to be, a lot of the time it gets very messy for no particular reason. And I feel like that's one of the big problems with the movement, because it feels like there are a lot of double standards going on, which make things unnecessarily complicated. So, you know, that's just something else that I noticed. It's not very good in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening. I was in Seattle this winter, and I saw a march/protest. I'm not like completely sure what exactly they were protesting, but they were just like mostly, I think all of them were white, about 20 of them, college-age kids in six-figure cars, like more expensive cars than I ever saw in such close proximity to each other. And they were just like walking down the street saying, we don't care about economics, we don't care about money, we don't care about politics. And I was just kind of looking at that, and I was thinking, oh, you don't care about economics? Do you know how much your car costs? Like, it's one of these things that, like, a privileged, like, clearly their parents must have a lot of money, because you don't make money by walking down the street saying you don't care about economics. So like they didn't buy those cars, somebody else bought them for them. And so like clearly they had like the privilege of being from a rich family. And yet they're walking down the street denouncing the very things that makes it possible for them to walk down the street just saying things instead of working. So it's like this paradox where they aren't the ones hurt like by capitalism or something. They aren't like why would they be saying that when they're clearly the ones benefiting from economics and money and etc.
Yeah, I see that a lot too. It's just a lot of people, it's like I pointed out, like the keyboard warriors thing. It feels like a lot of people, they just and like what I said at the very beginning too, it's like people, they just want other people to think that, you know, like they're doing their best, they're fighting for a good cause and whatever. And in reality, it doesn't really make sense for them to say much, because it feels more like the woke movement is kind of trying to absorb the side that it villainizes, which doesn't really, or not villainize, not necessarily the right word. It is trying to like absorb the side that it's opposed to, which is really odd, because you think that if they didn't agree, they wouldn't really want to associate with people like that, right? But then at the same time, they're so ready to kind of like take it in these people. I don't know, it just doesn't really make much sense to me. Because on one side they seem very aggressive, like a lot of like the loudest people, they seem very aggressive, but on the other hand, like you think they wouldn't want to associate, and yet they do somehow. It just, I don't really understand the point. It seems more like the end goal is to just create like one big like collective like mindset about like certain topics, rather than actually bettering like the world or anything. Because I don't like see any like dismantling of anything happening, honestly, even though we've been talking about this for over a year now. So it really makes me wonder what the point of all of this is, because I don't see action being taken. So what could they possibly be interested in doing?
Yeah, I honestly have a feeling that people who, like a lot of the more vicious followers, extreme followers of the woke movement, like they're just there to like get their emotions out about whatever topic.
Okay.
They aren't really there to change anything because changing things takes logic and reason and time and effort.
Mm-hmm.
Walking down the street saying we don't care about economics is very easy.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
actually doing something is not that easy, and I don't think they really want to do it. I think they're pretty good with just being in this position where they're just allowed to do whatever and just let their emotions out.
Mm-hmm.
But
mm-hmm.
I also agree with the point that like the very people who are supposed to be the enemies of the woke movement are a part of the woke movement, which is like with those college kids who were like clearly not suffering from poverty, and yet they were basically saying something that somebody who is would be saying. So it's a very strange contradiction.
Yeah, I see that happen a lot, and like I mentioned earlier, like when I said that, oh, like a friend of mine was getting like harassed because she wasn't posting stuff. It almost seems like there's some kind of it almost seems like they want action, but kind of like a simulation of action rather than actual like stuff happening. Because like she was doing stuff, she was donating or whatever, like she was helping out somehow, and yet people were still harassing her for not showing stuff on her story, which really doesn't help much unless you're kind of unless I don't know, you're sharing like, oh, like if you get hit by tear gas, this is how you should like wash your eyes out or something like that. Like unless it's something like that, I don't really see how it helps. Especially since, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the information that is being shared is information sourced from an echo chamber of already similar perspectives. So it's like everybody's already heard that before. It's also why I tend to be reluctant to share certain things because I've already seen that 3 times, like 5 times already on other people's stories. So I don't really feel the need to share it again on mine since I'm sure that other people will have already seen it. So you know, stuff like that. In any case, it seems more like, despite a call for action, there isn't any action happening. So it's just it makes everything very confusing. I don't really understand what the point is.
Yeah, I also think that the whole like posting things and like even being present during like certain movements, I feel like a lot of people don't do it because they genuinely believe or follow this movement or support it in any way. It's just like this social thing that you have to do, how like in the 19th century it was like polite to bow to people if they were like higher standing than you are. And now it's like, oh, well, you have to do this because this is just what you're expected to do. It's like this social construct, basically.
Yeah. I was also thinking, this isn't directly related to what we're talking about, but again, like I don't really know. What I was thinking about earlier also was that I really wonder how it must look to other people, like what we're doing right now. Because for example, I know there are like a lot of memes about foreigners just kind of looking at what's going on like here and being like, oh my God, what is going on? Because it's getting kind of very heated. So, because I know that, for example, there are some people who I met in Japan who follow me on Instagram. And so it always makes me feel very self-conscious when I share my story and like stuff that I see, because I'm not really sure how they will interpret it. And I feel like that's another big problem with the woke movement is that we're kind of pushing how we think on other cultures, even though they think differently. So while it seems like people are saying, oh, you know, like respect other cultures, at the same time they're saying like, oh, like you can't do this, or if this culture does this, it's bad and they're being like XYZ, which I've never really understood because I mean, according to like the theory of like wokeness, a different culture has different reasons for existing that way, and sure, it may have problems, but it's not really your place to criticize it if you don't really understand anything about it, you know? Kind of like the whole thing with cultural appropriation as well. So unless it's like people actually part of a culture who are saying that it's not okay, it's usually kind of difficult to figure out what's going on, I guess. Yeah, that's something else that I was thinking about as well.
Yeah, when I talk to my relatives who live in a different country, and so just like ask me like, what are your interests now or something, and I'm like trying to think in my head how I could possibly explain like the whole situation and the perspectives, and I can't come up with anything they would understand.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have like a different set of problems. I guess it's a lot simpler for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
it's a very like not the most diverse country. They don't really think about like races or cultures or anything else really. So
Mm-hmm.
it's very difficult to communicate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also there's also a big disconnect between, because what I've noticed is that a lot of woke people tend to be like, as you pointed out, younger people, so like maybe especially around college kids, those people tend to be like very active in it because, you know, they're like getting education, they're kind of like excited, they're learning new things. So it makes sense that they would want to contribute to discussion, but I've also noticed that there's kind of like a very big disconnect between like that group of people and older people, because older people are usually the ones who tend to hold more controversial opinions, and yet the ones getting harassed for opinions that they don't actually hold are young people who aren't old people who think that way. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because it feels like sometimes people are forgetting that times are changing and that a lot of people today are a lot more progressive, and yet it almost seems like the wrong people are being targeted. But then at the same time, should people be targeted anyway? Because it's not like, I mean, if you've gone your whole life thinking a certain way, one person saying to you, well, it hurts my feelings, or that's not really correct, or that's not really true, it won't necessarily change mind, right? So I don't know. I feel sometimes it feels like the wrong group is being targeted, but then, you know, also the question arises of, should anyone be targeted at all? And if not, then how should we approach the situation of disconnect?
I was actually thinking about like why is the woke movement so popular with the younger people, but then like a lot of the like older middle-aged people kind of frown upon it. And then it hit me that it's not actually the first time that something like this happened, and that like 40 years ago, the same people who are now seen as not progressive thought they were progressive, and they were frowned upon by the older generation. And like the woke movement isn't necessarily like the first of its kind.
Mm-hmm.
Like there have been similar movements before, and the people who have participated in some before are like kind of on the opposite side now, which
Mm-hmm.
kind of makes me think that like the whole extreme of woke is a bit of a phase that's going to like pass as people grow up and have more life experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a very good point. It's really easy to forget, and I know I forget about that all the time, how eventually when I'll be like around 40 or 50, I might say something, and then like some child passing by will look at me with horror in his eyes and say, how could you possibly say that? That's so untrue. And it's really weird because right now, like you said, it's like this whole thing like, yeah, we're right, we have like these progressive opinions, we're respectful, we're fantastic. And then later on, we'll all of a sudden be the ones under fire. And it's like this never ending cycle again, where people will just keep evolving. I don't know, it feels like things are kind of getting more aggressive too, like especially with the internet. Like people are getting a lot more defensive, a lot more aggressive. So yeah, I feel like perhaps this isn't necessarily something that's a phase, but it will kind of die down eventually. Won't always just kind of disappear. There'll always be like stuff brewing below the surface, but eventually it will be us, like I said, under fire. So I guess it'll always just stay there until the next generation comes along and challenges us for it.
Yeah, I think you have a very good point. What was I going to say? I think that's like the whole thing was like life experience and like the different movements, is that it's like the real question is how much of it is truly progressive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, are we really progressive or are we regressive? Like,
that's a good point.
There's some things that you just like look at that are happening today and that like weren't a thing 40 years ago, and you kind of think like, wasn't it better in this specific aspect 40 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Like, say 40 years ago, there really wasn't the same amount of anger,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. And people like weren't screaming at each other over the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of think about that, and then you kind of think about today where you have to like censor yourself a lot more, and you kind of are torn between these two camps. And they're just getting more and more extreme every year. And it kind of makes you think like, in a way, people were more open-minded back then than they are now.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah, that's a very good point.
Certain aspects, I think we've actually regressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, people back then were kind of very hands-on. Like if they didn't like you, they could just eliminate you, for example, or if they thought you were wrong or something like that. So they kind of solved problems very quickly, but here it's just a lot of push and pull. And though it feels like we might be getting, like you said, we might be getting more progressive with our opinions, but with our discussion skills, not so much. Like, sure, we don't necessarily start like brawling every single time we disagree, but because we contain ourselves each time, first of all, there's like this buildup of anger, right? Like when you don't say what you think, like eventually it's gonna explode. And second of all, there's just this whole thing of, like you mentioned, like these black and white kind of opinions that force ourselves to censor ourselves, that don't really get us anywhere in discussion. Because if you're just saying like yes, it's just basically a game of yes and no. Just say yes and no, yes, no, yes, no, and nobody really wins, right? Because there's no necessarily any reason behind it. So yeah, I think that you have a pretty good point there.
Something else that I wanted to bring up is kind of related to the woke movement, but also kind of something that I've experienced a lot in like school with teenagers nowadays. And I think I'm kind of guilty of that too, is that like teenagers think they're so smart and they understand every single problem in the world. And again, I feel like I'm guilty of that too, but at the same time, like sometimes I look at like my peers and it says they're saying, I'm just like, oh my God, it's almost silly how they can say things they don't really understand anything about. Like, we were reading Animal Farms this year, and a lot of people were pointing out like, oh, education is everything. Like, if you're educated, you will understand politics and you can prevent a totalitarian government, etc., etc. And a lot of them were like bringing up people from states like Idaho or Montana, and they were saying like, oh, they're like uneducated and stupid because of it. And I was just thinking like, okay, there's education, and then there's intelligence, and then there's life experience, and those three things are not necessarily the same.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are people who have never gone to college who are very smart. They'll have like a lot of common sense, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in a way, I was just wondering about that. Like people from big cities, they're kind of in a comfort bubble. But then people from like more rural areas, their life tends to be a little bit more like they have a little bit more self-responsibility. Because if you're in a big city, you're usually just somebody working for a big company, like that's working for a bigger company. And people don't really have to do a lot of thinking, I guess. So like there's this job you do and like all of your thinking is just within it. But then you don't really have to think about like how what you do makes money and how it is sold and how just like how the whole system works. Because it's very complicated. Like I have no idea how it works. I'll admit that. But then if you're like a rancher, like you're actually running your own business, basically. And you have to like think about things a lot more. And it kind of makes me wonder if like the so-called uneducated people, even though I'm not sure why the word uneducated was used here, because I mean like everybody has a high school education normally, or like almost everybody in the US at least. I think like a lot of the people from like relatively poor rural areas might actually be smarter in a way because they have like more as a common sense that kind of comes with having a lot of self-responsibility.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's a difference between street smart and book smart, and I feel like a lot of people forget that. Like, for example, when you hear intelligence being pointed out, it's often directed at, oh, how good are your grades, or something like that. Which I find myself, I'm kind of like constricted in that too, because I find it kind of hard to break out of the whole thing. If your grades are bad, that means that you're not very smart. Like, directed both of myself and other people. So. I definitely agree. I think that's a very good point there. And there's also like like Animal Farm. The whole thing with Animal Farm is that a bunch of people, or not people, a bunch of animals who were supposedly uneducated, they got educated, and what happened? No one was happy. So a lot of there's the difference between education and education, because on one side there's education as in like indoctrination and brainwashing, and on the other hand there's education as an actual growth of mind and development of perspectives and whatever. And I feel like you said, a lot of people forget that just because you have a higher degree, or you have like a better education, does not necessarily mean that you know how to think better. Again, street smart versus book smart, there's a difference. And there's also like this whole I don't know where I read this. It might have been in the article, or it might have been somewhere else, but I've seen it be pointed out that a lot of college kids, when they go into college, like their opinions might be more diverse depending on which college you're going to, where you are, whatever. Or I think this is like mostly applicable here. But then everybody comes out of college kind of thinking the same way. And that really makes you wonder, like, sure, the professors might be imparting like new perspectives on some of their students, but first of all, there are students who never really changed their minds, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just kind of indicative of how it seems like people are focusing more on, again, kind of creating this hive mind, rather than sharing opinions and learning from each other's life experiences. So yeah, that really brings into question what education actually is and how to approach it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that it's like you can be able to engineer a nuclear reactor, but like you wouldn't have any street smarts. Like those are very different things. And I also think that the thing about like common sense is that it can't really be taught. Because like if you teach somebody how to think, you're indoctrinating them.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's something that a person has to learn for themselves. And I think that like a person's full opinion and worldview, they don't really like exist until they're like well into their 30s, because like as children and teenagers we're like really impacted by our parents and then by our peers, our friends. And then we go to college, we're also impacted by professors and like people that also like studying a specific field. And then you get a job and you meet a more diverse set of people, different ages, different from different places, with different opinions. And then kind of just like after that, you kind of have this whole set of opinions that you know about because you got to know all of them from all those different places and people. And then after that, you can kind of start forming your own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that really calls into the question this whole thing with forcing people to decide. Like, for example, it really bothers me when people ask, like, oh, like their candidates XYZ are running for president this year. Who would you vote for if you were of age? And I feel like these kinds of questions, like, despite placing a lot of emphasis on like privacy and stuff, a lot of people seem to, despite being part of the movement, they seem to disregard that somehow, because I feel like it's really unfair to make, like you mentioned, like make young people choose a side when they don't really have enough life experience to be able to do so. Like, how are you supposed to know what president to vote for if you've never, for example, paid any taxes, or you've never had to actually support yourself on your own, or you've never had to deal with immigration policies or something like that? Like, how are you supposed to know when you don't really even have any life experience? And what's scary is that a lot of this isn't just adults forcing kids to choose, it's kids forcing each other to choose, which would be funny if it weren't so sad, because really it's kind of like two toddlers who don't know how to ride a bike trying to teach each other how to ride a bike, you know? So it's just it just doesn't seem like a very good idea to me to keep forcing people to choose sides, because if you don't know anything about either side and you never experienced it for yourself, how are you supposed to know what to do? So that's just something that has really always bothered me about the woke movement. It's the whole thing with, you're young, you have to like take action now, kind of like educate yourself now. Like, what is there to educate myself about if I've never experienced these things? Like, it's kind of like you mentioned, like being taught to think versus learning from life experience, kind of like being told how to solve a problem rather than learning how to solve a problem, you know? So, yeah, I think that that's something that a lot of people are forgetting. Also, I feel like we've been talking for a really long time, so unless there are like any other topics you would like to mention, I think it would be okay to just like recap and move on.
We can move on.
Okay. So overall, I think that the woke movement does have its merits. It's always good to be accepting and understanding of other people, but the way that they're going about it is really odd. There are a lot of double standards, a lot of confusing of, well, unless you're this, you can't do this and that. So I feel like they kind of need to sort themselves out, figure out what direction they want to head in, and if they actually want to make a positive change, and that's their goal, and not some other kind of like subplot that we don't know about. I feel like they should just like, chase that goal and actually make a good change if that's what they really
want. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that they lack reason and organization behind their actions, and I think there's a bit of they're not very decided on what they actually want.